Key draft document at the crucial climate change conference in Dubai calls for a complete move away from fossil fuel. Is this at all realistic? And if so, when? That's going to be our big focus. But as we look at that, I just want you to consider a couple of important data points. You know, fossil fuel under fire at Cop28. Perhaps there is a direct reason for that. Carbon emissions directly linked to global warming, and that's a problem. No two ways about that. But the global stocktake draft proposal on fossils is now called for a phase out of unabated coal and an orderly and just phase out of fossil fuels. Can there be a just phase out of fossil fuels? Who is it just for? Is a question mark that is a question that needs to be answered. Fossil fuels, therefore, in the crosshairs of the climate meet. Fossil fuels are, of course, the largest contributor to climate change. Fossil fuels account for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. They account for nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. So the fossil fuel feud, is a phase down or a phase out realistic at all? We've got a wonderful panel with us. Linda Culture is Executive Director of at Strategic Perspectives. Ulka Kelkar, Director of Climate World Resources Institute, India. Navroz Dubash, Senior Fellow at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. And Aarti Khosla, Director of Climate Trends. Thank you all very much for being with us. Navroz, let me come to you first. India managed to get an outcome at G20 earlier on. No one was expecting it. The Prime Minister's current stature at Cop28, he was the only head of state to share the opening plenary with the Cop28 and the UNFCCC presidency, and pitched India to host COP33. That shows positive light not only on the India-UAE bilateral but also India's climate leadership. How do you see India's climate leadership growing, especially as India has repeatedly projected itself as a voice of the global south?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Vishnu. I'm delighted to share it with my fellow panelists. So, I think that what we see is that the government of India and Prime Minister Modi is building on the G20 momentum. And it's actually very interesting, coming to the key point that you flagged in your opening around fossil fuels. India had actually advocated the language around phasing down of fossil fuels in the G20 statement, but it was actually quite controversial there. And everybody knew it would come back here. There are other elements that will be picked up, such as a doubling of renewable energy, a tripling of renewable energy, and a doubling of energy efficiency. But the big fight, this COP, very clearly is going to be about whether or not and exactly how the language on fossil fuels will be included.
Okay. Aarti, India had championed the cause of tripling the global targets of renewable energy by 2030 at G20, but it backed out from signing that pledge at COP28. Is that a sign that India will find it tough to move away from fossil fuels?
So the first version of the negotiating text is out, and as you can see, there are several elements of fossil fuel language in the text. In my opinion, this is also the first time that any language on fossil fuel, particularly coal, if ever, will make its way into a negotiated outcome, if it happens like that. We saw 2 years ago in Glasgow, there was flip-flop on including coal phase-out, and I think the decision, the feeling that the Indian delegation gets is that coal is always singled out. What you asked was about the pledge, and the pledge as such is not part of the negotiating documents or texts. But however, there are big emitting countries who have committed as well in G20, and a lot of about 118 countries signed the pledge as well in Dubai. And noteworthy that both India and China did not sign the pledge, and you can guess estimate why the reasons were. And if you look at the actual language of the text, then you will understand, the way it reads is that the renewable deployment has to necessarily be accompanied by phase down of unabated coal, and actually in particular ending investments in coal. And, most experts are saying that the way India has defended its stance on coal, whether it's due to peak load reasons or it is due to energy security and geopolitical reasons, the sentiment is that just singling out coal is not something which sits well. But as well, the reality is that in Dubai, the way the COP has been happening, it just gives a feeling that fossil fuels have really made their mark to enter some kind of a policy determination space. Countries will be reluctant to engage now for various reasons, and you can have a range of countries. It's not just India. There is, you can name any country, and the fossil interests are huge, including from Saudi and Qatar to even US. But it's pretty clear that countries will be forced to think in the next 2 or 3 years on how to strategize and go away from fossil fuels. Everybody will have to think about this. And I suppose whether or not India has signed the pledge, to me, is less insignificant. The Prime Minister was there in the ceremonial opening. He mentioned that we are committed to renewables, doubling energy efficiency. He mentioned about the G20 and the Voice of Global South. And there were several elements to it, as well as India's own commitments to 2030 targets of 450 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel assets, which definitely amounts to the kind of commitments which are there in tripling renewables and doubling efficiency.
Alka, what would it take for India to transition to a zero fossil fuel economy? Is that even realistic and possible?
Very hard to say now, looking forward 3, 4, 5 decades into the future. But we have to make it possible. We have to find our own version of it, our own way of developing that does not replicate the mistakes of the Western countries, where they used a lot of fossil fuels and used up the carbon space, the carbon budget of all the populations. We have to find a way that builds on our own strengths. We are blessed to have a lot of solar and wind power potential. We have to make that into a reality. But certainly, as far as the current situation is concerned, the bulk of our power continues to come from coal and other fossil fuel sources. Our vehicles still run basically on petrol and diesel, even though you would have seen a great acceleration, a great momentum in electric vehicle space. And our industry also ranges from some very heavy industry like cement and steel, which continue to use chemical processes that generate a lot of fossil fuel emissions, a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to switch to new technologies, it would mean that even our micro, small and medium enterprises that form the bulk of our industry would need to find a way to transition. So this is exactly the just transition that you spoke about at the beginning of this segment. And it will mean that people, workers, communities in each of these sectors that I've mentioned, their livelihoods and the social impacts on them will have to be taken care of, even as we make these shifts towards lower carbon technologies and lower carbon fuels. But certainly there are a lot of studies which show that in each of these sectors, there is a pathway that tries to maintain or rather tries to meet the demand in each of these sectors, but in a lower carbon way, in a greener way. And some of these can definitely generate new green jobs, new potential. Green hydrogen is something that the government is placing big bets on, and is also providing incentives to industry, so that at a very early stage in some of these sectors, we are able to mobilize the necessary capital, private as well as public, and try to embark on these transitions, which will take a few decades. But really, this is the right time in which to do it, as long as industry, policy, and society all collaborate with each other and all move along in the same direction.
Navroz, there's also the issue of historic responsibility when it comes to carbon emissions. Developing countries say that they need to have an opportunity to grow, and that it's unfair that their economic growth, their industrial growth has to be stunted in a sense as a result of emission regulations, arguments which say that fossil fuel has to go away. One of the ways in which this concern is being addressed is through a carbon budget. How exactly does a carbon budget work?
So this is an important idea. And essentially what it says is that if we look at the temperature that we have to stay within, 1.5 or 2 degrees, that can be translated to a certain amount of carbon that we can burn. And beyond that, we are then running the risk of exceeding those temperature limits. Now, the challenging part really is this. As Ulka said, everybody eventually has to move past dependence on fossil fuels in order to stay within this carbon budget. But the question is, who should move first? Who should move second? How fast is it feasible to move? And one of the challenges really is that if we have scarce fossil fuels available to burn, the question is, who should burn them, right? How do we make that decision? And what we should do, if you're serious about fairness, is allow those who have got into the habit of burning them to keep burning them. that cuts against fairness and equity entirely. And so, in fact, something I've written in the past suggests that if we have scarce fossil fuels, we should be allocating those scarce fossil fuels to where they lead to the greatest welfare gains, which is in poorer and developing countries. Other studies have shown, for example, that if you try and pivot away from fossil fuels, and as I said, I completely agree, all countries have to do this, the speed of the transition really matters. And so some of the research suggests that, for example, the coal transition that is expected from some scenarios that the IPCC and others have put together would place demands on some of the larger developing countries, including India, that are actually greater than any other country has demonstrated in the past in terms of the speed of transition.
Yeah.
So actually, this gets talked about in technical terms in the COP, but it's a deeply political decision. Agreeing to phase out fossil fuels implies an agreement on how that is to be done. And in the absence of that agreement on how and who, there is a reluctance to actually come up with the overarching statement. So that's what we're really seeing playing out at COP this week.
Linda, at the COP meetings, there's been a stalemate on finance discussions. Developing countries say they cannot, transition fast enough without financial support. Are there new mechanisms to mobilize finance which are coming in, and how can countries like India access them?
Thanks so much for having me. Good evening from Dubai. Indeed, I want to just echo what previous speaker says. I think the direction of travel is clear, but then it's a discussion on how fast we're transitioning away from fossil fuels and with what support. And that's really the point you just picked up. We've seen more and more financing coming from developed countries, but it's far from enough. So we see more public and private finance that needs to go. The International Energy Agency said that 4 trillion in clean investments are needed by 2030. So it's clear it cannot only be public finance, it also has to be private finance. But so far, we are still at a level of 1 trillion investments last year. So that needs to quadruple. So we can talk about the doubling energy efficiency, tripling of renewable energy, and quadrupling of clean investments. And it's clear that especially a country like India, where the prime minister has big ambitions to be a leader on solar and on renewables, we need to help them really have that leadership. There are mechanisms around de-risking, about taking over guarantees, but it's really clear that the sense of direction is clear. And it's on the developed countries to really scale up the support, also through multinational development banks, to make that possible.
Aarti, there is supposed to be the global stocktake at Cop28. Can you explain what is this global stocktake, and what are the dividing lines between the global north and the south?
Well, that's what we've been discussing here the last couple of minutes. This is once in a 5-year exercise, a kind of a periodic review, which was written in the Paris Agreement, that after every 5 years, countries will get together and we will evaluate progress that has been made on climate action by countries, which includes both mitigation, adaptation, as well as means of implementation, which essentially means, is there finance and technology to even make the emission reductions that we hope we will make through mitigation? That itself is known as the global stocktake process, which is happening in Dubai at the moment. And kind of enshrined in this process is the sentiment that progressively there will be ambition that will be increased on how to adapt and how to mitigate and how to provide finance. And that itself is a very tricky process, as previous speakers have mentioned. It's not just about what emission reduction will mean. It's really about how that will also impact the kind of growth and development which a lot of emerging economies across the world will do, how it will impact the least developed countries, what it will do to countries which are middle income, lower income. And these are very, very complicated discussions, which are not just about the changing climate and how the changing weather is impacting you and me. It's literally about how our production systems for energy will change, what will it do to our industrialization, how will it impact the lives and livelihoods of vast majority of people which are employed in those sectors. So pretty much, that kind of setting of baselines of countries which will strengthen future climate ambition is the kind of activity which must happen at the GST and is happening. But this will go through multiple rounds, and there are technical dialogues that have been happening over the past 2 years. A draft synthesis text was prepared in the run-up to the COP, and that basically showed what we anyway know, that there is huge gaps in terms of where we should be. We should have been on the path to reduce emissions by 43% from 2010 levels in about 7 to 8 years by 2030. And between last year and now, we have increased emissions by 1.2%. So, these are critical conversations. We cannot wish them away. There will have to be some kind of a explicit arrangement that countries agree on how they will find some kind of a balance in who should act first, who should bring the money. And one point that I wanted to make on money and finance, which Linda also alluded to, and which I thought was a good thing at this COP at least, is given how much there is gray areas on how finance is discussed, for the first time there is the word quality of finance in some text that I read somewhere. I don't know if it'll finally make it or whether I read it right or not, but for a long time there has been more demand for grants and not loans, or not the kind of finance which raises indebtedness of the receiving countries. And I think to discuss quality is important.
Well, Alka, while these negotiations are going on, we're actually seeing the impact of climate change in real time. There's a cyclone which has hit Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, and the cost associated with extreme weather events, huge. I mean, billions of dollars from Cyclone Fani, from Phylin, Amphan, etc., etc. There's the dialogue on adaptation which is taking place. Where is this headed presently?
You're absolutely right, Vishnu. This is something where we are seeing the impacts of climate change, and not just on people. We have seen the images are coming out of Chennai, but also industrial production is being shut down. That is also something that directly hits the economy, not just of India, but the supply chains that exist globally. In terms of the discussions on adaptation, there are two streams of negotiation. One is on something called a global goal for adaptation. For mitigation, for 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are able to bring all our ambitions down to a single number. But for adaptation, how do you do that? You need to have adaptation in every sector. You express it in different units. Could you have one universal goal? That is something there's been a lot of discussion on. The other big issue is around adaptation finance. Aarti spoke about the quality of finance. Linda spoke about how there's a lot of private finance coming in. Private finance and concessional loans, grants, these are not very well suited towards sectors like agriculture, human health, water, and forestry. They tend to go more towards, mitigation, renewable energy, green hydrogen, all of these kinds of commercial sectors. So adaptation finance has been lagging behind. It's been about 20% of the total amount of climate finance. And a couple of years ago, it was decided that it should become at least half of climate finance. But these pledges, these goals have really not been reflected in the reality, in the numbers that we've seen coming out of the last 2 years. And one of the interesting things that's happening is that, your channel has talked about the loss and damage fund that's been set up. Yes. And while that's been a major victory, recent reports show that actually countries are perhaps diverting funding away from adaptation finance to put in money into the loss and damage fund. So that is a kind of game that we have to avoid. We have to make sure that the funding that's coming in for adaptation, which is urgently needed, is new and additional funding, and it is disbursed in a way that it reaches the people who need it the most.
Sure.
Reaches them in a timely way so that you can have early warning systems, climate information services, and many other kinds of actions.
Navroz, just to go back to the entire point on whether there can be a future, in a finite period of time without fossil fuels. If you look at the transportation sector in India, which is growing exponentially, and conversation on green hydrogen becoming a reality, how soon before it becomes affordable? How soon before the technology in cars also becomes affordable?
Obviously, what we've seen over time is that once these technologies scale up, they tend to accelerate and become viable much faster than anybody thought. In a sense, the technologies follow kind of an S curve rather than a linear curve. So there's a slow growing part and then a rapidly ramping up part. And so the key question really is, when do investors think that these technologies are a better bet than the fossil fuel technologies they're going to replace? And I think what's really exciting is that we're close to that point in many of these technologies. Certainly when it comes to electric vehicles, battery technologies, solar panels, I think that's true. I think green hydrogen is further back at the lower part of that S-curve. There's a lot of hype around it, but there's lots of uncertainty as well. But the key point is you want to get across that hump where investors find it more attractive to invest in these new technologies than in the old ones. But this brings us back to the question of finance that you raised. Most of these low carbon transitions are highly capital intensive. So for example, renewable energy, there's no operating cost, there's no running cost. You don't have to buy fuel, but you do have to spend much more money upfront installing solar arrays or building windmills, and also perhaps installing battery technology. So the question of finance and mobilizing finance is absolutely critical. And in India and in many other developing countries, the cost of capital is higher and the opportunity cost of capital is higher. That is, there are many other things that are needed for that capital to be deployed towards. So this question of mobilizing capital is really critical. So there's two parts to this fossil fuel story, I think. One is who moves and when. And in that, going back to the conversation we had about historical responsibility, it's very clear that developed economies really should be the ones to try and move faster. Yeah. And who mobilizes that capital and how is that made feasible? And that's the other big conversation, of course, going on at COP these days.
Linda, how do you see southern countries negotiating and standing their ground at COP? I mean, is this still essentially a playground for rich nations?
I think we've seen very many views reflected here. I think a lot of countries indeed voiced clearly that going from coal to renewables is a preferred pathway for them. But as was just said, we need to ensure that they can afford it. And that's where the public support from developed countries is coming in. And I think it's on every country's own decision to see how fast they do and which technologies they use. But it's really the finance comes in there. And I think we've seen a lot of the Global South leaders actually as champions here. They've been very vocal that they don't want to have a choice between fighting poverty and fighting climate change. They've been very vocal that they need more finance. And it was discussed that it's about the quality of finance. So it has to be more grants. It has to be more long-term project support, especially to bring down the cost of these new technologies. And this is the debate that we're going to see here in the second week. Especially inspiring were also Kenya's President Ruto and Brazilian's President Lula. And he's obviously taking over the G20 presidency from India next year. And I would really hope that he's inspired by India's leadership at the G20, the way we've seen it this year. And he's taking the conversation forward so that it's really clear there will be more finance, and now we need to see how we can scale up these green technologies deployment. We've seen that especially in the European Union and the US, a lot of investments have happened because they see the benefit. It creates jobs, it improves the air quality, and it's global markets for these green technologies that are growing. Yes. So I think a lot here in COP are really convinced that India can play a powerful role in this global green supply chain.
But I'd like to thank you all very much. Just to simplify a lot of the key issues which are taking place at the climate meet in Dubai. Also, the entire issue of fossil fuel and historic responsibility, and of course, sustainable growth. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. We were talking about extreme climate events, possibly linked to climate change. One major cyclone has hit the coast of Andhra Pradesh. It's resulted in flooding in parts of Tamil Nadu, including Chennai. Waterlogging still present in several parts of Chennai. What exactly is the situation now? More than 48 hours since electricity was cut off in some areas, communications patchy. The Air Force, the Coast Guard, they were all in action trying to help people out with food. Water levels in some areas have still not come down. We'll leave you with this report.
After wreaking havoc in Chennai, Cyclone Mikja made landfall near Bapatla in Andhra Pradesh, claiming 2 lives and 11 livestock. Huge area under paddy was inundated. Ravi Kumar is trying to salvage some of his crop by shifting it to a nearby mill and godown. Over 60 sacks of paddy, each weighing up to 40 kgs, is being loaded onto the tracker near Machilipatnam in Krishna district.
ఇది రైతుకి తీరని నష్టం అండి. రైతు అనే ఎవరైనా తీరని నష్టం. మరి ఈ పంట పండి 6 కాలాలు 6 నెలలు పండించి తీరా రైతు కళల్లో ఆనందం చూసే టయానికి ఈ అకాల తుఫాన్ రావటం, వర్షాల వల్ల పంటలు తీవ్ర నష్టం జరిగింది. ఇప్పుడు ఈ మునిగిపోయిన పొలాలు ఉన్నాయి, ఇట్లా నీళ్లు చేరిపోయినాయి. తర్వాత ఈ వైరు పైరు కూడా పడిపోయిందండి. కొంత తయారైన పంటలు ఉన్నాయి, కొన్ని తయారైన పంటలు ఉన్నాయి.
Over 25 villages were inundated. Once the water in the fields recedes, accurate crop loss can be estimated. In Bapatla alone, paddy was being cultivated in over 85,000 hectares and crop on 1,200 hectares was harvested. Most of it has been washed away.
As far as this cyclone is concerned, the Rait Bharosa Kendras are there, and voluntary system we have about 2 lakh plus volunteers. So keeping in view this cyclone, farmers have been advised to take care of the crop on the field and harvested crop. So farmers have been advised to shift the harvested crop to the safer places.
Over 300 trees have fallen and 35 roads were waterlogged. Road infrastructure, traffic disruption and flight operations are being restored in affected districts.
Except 1 or 2 casualties here and there. And the damage to infrastructure is there. Road infrastructure got damaged. A lot of trees fell. And the electrical poles, the power infrastructure got disturbed. And irrigation tanks, we had breaches. So we are getting some preliminary reports. So we'll be making effort to restore them temporarily, immediately.
15 lakh million tons of paddy crops have been shifted to various mills and godowns. Volunteers have also been incorporated for helping several of these farmers in shifting their crops. Now, the government has promised to help the farmers of especially Krishna as well as Rayalaseema regions to ensure that they are given adequate compensation after assessing the damage in about a week from now. With camera person Govind Murthy, Pratibha Raman in Vijayawada for NDTV.